Hi, I'm Steve Ulfelder, longtime Southborough resident and author of the Conway Sachs Mystery Series. The latest book in the series is called Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage. I hope you enjoy these books.
Welcome to the Southborough Library. My name is Ryan Donovan. I have both the pleasure of being the director of the library and introducing tonight's speaker, Steve Ulfelder. Steve has lived in Southborough for over 20 years. His debut novel, Purgatory Chasm, was published in 2011. It was nominated for the Edgar and Anthony Awards in the Best Novel category and named Best First Mystery by RT Book Reviews. The second Conway Sachs novel, The Whole Lie, was published in 2012. And the third, Shotgun Lullaby, in 2013. Book 4, which Steve is here tonight to talk about, Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage, recently came out in May.
That's correct.
Please join me in welcoming back one of our favorite local authors, Steve Ulfelder.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, thank you, Ryan, and I want to thank Sandy and Hal and the Friends of the Library for hosting me tonight and putting so much effort into this, and I thank you all for coming out. I am Steve Ulfelder. I was actually saying to somebody, some dates stick in your head a little bit, and yesterday, I believe, was the 20th anniversary that we closed on our house down near the train station. I won't say the street number. It's always fun to be here and talk a little bit about my books, and I've got something special planned tonight. So here's what I propose to talk about. We've got a nice mix. Some of you have heard me talk before about my work, some have not. So here's what I propose to do. I'll talk a little bit about the series so that some of you who are unfamiliar with it can get up to speed. I'll give you a fairly basic little teaser introduction to Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage, the newest book, which is doing very well, by the way. And then I wanted to talk about something new, and this book lends itself very nicely to me talking about setting and a sense of place and why I set my books in the Metro West area, which I do, by the way. So we'll do that for a little while, for the bulk of the talk, I think. And then I'd love to take some questions from people, and we'll go very wide-ranging with the questions. I know there may be some of you who are authors yourselves and want to talk about the writing process. Some of you may want to talk about the publishing industry, which is in a tumultuous state, as it always seems to be. And so we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about during the Q&A period. And then I've got some books for sale in the back of the room, and I'd love to sign one for anybody who wants one. All right, so I write a hard-boiled mystery series featuring a guy named Conway Sachs, who lives in Framingham. There are two other things you should know about Conway that are very important to his character. One is that he is a washed-up NASCAR driver who had the talent and the potential to be great, but he drank his opportunity away and crashed and burned long ago. And the other thing you should know about him is that he is now a recovering alcoholic who's been sober for some time. And what he does in these books, he's not an actual cop or a private eye, but rather what's known in the business as an amateur sleuth. He's not technically a detective, but he solves cases. And who does he solve cases for? His fellow recovering alcoholics. He's in a very tight-knit AA group based out of a fictitious church in Framingham. And so anytime any of these fellow alcoholics come to him with a problem, he fixes the problem, which takes him to some interesting and sometimes dark and violent places, because the problems that these newly recovering alcoholics tend to have are not pretty. You know, they're often pretty gamey, and these are murder mysteries, so there's always a murder involved somewhere along the line. And by the way, in case I refer to this later on, this AA group, which I invented, is called the Barn Burners. They meet at a church in downtown Framingham. It's not an actual church, but in my head I know exactly where it is located. And so you'll catch me referring to the Barn Burners once in a while, his AA group. Ryan did a great job telling you about the first 3 books. So let's get to the 4th book, Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage, which just came out May 6th, so almost exactly a month ago. First off, may I brag just a little bit, just a little, because if I don't brag, nobody's going to brag for me. The Associated Press got this book off to a great start with a review that said, among other things, Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage solidifies Ulfelder's place as one of the best crime novelists to come out of Massachusetts since Dennis Lehane. And boy, I'll tell you what, anytime you're mentioned in the same sentence as Dennis Lehane, you go, yes, thank you very much, reviewer. So that was very flattering. And as I say, it got this book off out of the gates very nicely. Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage, a mouthful of a title, I admit, opens up in greater Los Angeles, in a very seedy area of Los Angeles, where this washed-up television star named Kenny Spoon has been kidnapped by a gang of professional kidnappers, essentially, a gang based out of Mexico named Los Bajamaros. And Conway's job is to rescue this young man. Why is it? Well, he's not that young. He's actually pushing 40. Why is Conway rescuing this young man? Well, now we get back to this barn burner and AA angle. Conway has a dear friend named Eudora Spoon, who he goes way back with, and she has said, my son is in trouble. He's in Los Angeles. He's a drunk. He takes pills. He's been kidnapped. Can you help me? And Conway, because this is what he does, and he lives by a code, and he rescues these people, goes off to Los Angeles and attempts to rescue this guy. And this is a very minor spoiler. He rescues him. We open up with this big action scene where Conway, against all odds, gets this guy out of the warehouse where he's being held and brings him back to Briar, Massachusetts, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, because that's what I'm talking about tonight. Once he gets him back to Briar, Massachusetts, we're still very early in the book, and this is when all sorts of mystery novel things start taking place. Somebody gets murdered. I won't tell you who, because that would be a major spoiler. It may not be the person you expect. Somebody gets murdered, and the question is, why was this guy kidnapped in the first place? Why was somebody close to this person murdered? And Conway starts to unravel things, risking life and limb and showing much daring do in the process. And there you go. There's my little intro summary teaser about Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage. As I say, well, I'm proud of this book. I'm proud of all of them. And this one's doing very well, and it seems to have kick-started some sales of some of my older books, too, which is always very gratifying. You'll note that I said Conway brings Kenny Spoon back to Briar, Massachusetts, which, by the way, is spelled B-R-Y-A-R. Briar, I've always set my books in Framingham and Metro West in general, and I've always used real town names. And in fact, I know some of you have read some of the books, and that's one of the things that people tell me all the time. Oh, it's fun to read a book where you know when you know where the things are happening. And Conway's girlfriend, Charlene, lives in Shrewsbury, and Conway is right in Framingham. And, let's see, in one of the books I had a murder in Hopkinton State Park where I take my dog for a walk all the time. And it's, it's fun reading that kind of stuff. But I will give you a funny little thing. My little inside joke is that one town that never appears in my books is Southborough. I've just made the choice to act as if Southborough does not exist in my books. So Hopkinton sort of bleeds into Northborough and Marlborough, and Framingham sort of bleeds into Westborough, and Southborough just doesn't exist. That's just my way of not mentioning my hometown. Until now, of course. So I did something, so usually I've got these very specific locations and, Tower Hill Botanic Gardens and all that. But I did something different this time around. I wanted to invent a town, a setting. And that is what Briar is. It's a fictitious town. Now, let me ask, I know at least one or two of you have read this book. Does anybody have a picture in their head as to where Briar, Massachusetts is specifically, if you've read the book? Even just shake your head or nod or say, some idea, okay, some ideas forming in your head. Well, here's where Briar is. If you take a town, if you took a town and in order to form that town, you took a chunk out of Hopkinton, just west of 495 there, and a chunk out of Upton, where it runs into Hopkinton, and then maybe took a little sort of chunk of Grafton. In other words, that is where Briar is. And I have a lot of fun with this setting, and I'm always sort of teasing as to where it is, because I know that people are going to read these books and say, oh, when he says Briar, he's really talking about Upton. Well, I'm not, so I make a point of saying, well, we were in Briar over near the Upton border, and then people go, oh, rats, that's not, I thought it was Upton, but it's not. So it's essentially a blue-collar, down at the heels, Blackstone Valley town that's got a lot in common with. Well, Grafton is actually kind of a fairly nice suburb these days, but think Upton, Milford, Medway, Mendon, Bellingham. Think that kind of town. Towns that are having a tough time these days. Manufacturing has left them. They're not sure exactly what their next step is as a town. And why did I invent a town rather than going with actual cities, which I always have in the past? I think it's because Briar is a smallish town, and I wanted to have the freedom to have things like a chief of police in Briar and various town offices and things like that without being unkind to somebody who's in an actual town. It's one thing to have a cop in Framingham. Framingham is big enough so that you can have a cop and it feels kind of like a generic thing. But if I, for example, had a chief of police in Grafton, well, you know, that's a little close to home for somebody. So I invented this town. And I'll tell you a couple things about the fictitious town of Briar. One, just to tell you where this town is at these days. The town keeps most of its offices, including the police department, in an old church. I think it's an old Lutheran church. That's because a few years ago, the town's offices were found to be slipping into a river, and the building was condemned, and the town had absolutely no money to build anything new, and so their only option was to slide into this church, which had essentially been abandoned. So that's the kind of tough situation that Briar faces. So there's a little primer on Briar. And one of the things that people ask me about a lot, I mentioned, was why Metro West? Why do you set your novels, when you think of Private Eyes, you think of Boston, you maybe think Miami, you think there are a lot of very famous detective series set in Paris, there are some in London, etc. Why Framingham? Well, at the time I was thinking about this series, it was essentially, this is what an overnight sensation I am, by the way. It was the 1990s, frankly, when I was first conceiving this series and thinking, what would I do? What would my detective look like? And in the 1990s, there was a guy you may have heard of named Robert Parker writing the Spencer novels. There was also a guy named Dennis Lehane who seemed to be doing pretty well with his detective novels set in Boston. Have any of you read Linda Barnes, she continues to write a very highly regarded and popular series set in Boston. And there was a guy named William Tapley, who has since passed away, who wrote some very popular Boston PI novels. So Boston was taken. Boston was too crowded with Private Eyes for me. And that's why I moved my stuff a little bit west to Framingham. So I did that. And when the publishing house that eventually bought my first book, Purgatory Chasm, was evaluating me and saying, do we want to buy this series and get started with it? One of the things that some of their editors asked was, well, Framingham, Massachusetts, and these are New York people, and they never, trust me, they never heard of Framingham. They barely heard of Boston. They know nothing about Framingham. And so they said, well, can Conway play on a bigger stage? You know, can we get him doing something a little grander and a little bigger and more public with a higher stakes, is what the editors like to call it. And being a good little doobie and a good little earnest writer who was trying to do right by my publisher, my second book, The Whole Lie, actually did raise the stakes, and many scenes in that novel are set in Beacon Hill and some of the swanker parts of Cambridge, and it concerns a gubernatorial election and sex scandals and that sort of thing. And that all went very well, and I enjoyed writing that book. But I just noticed that whenever Conway got into the finer places on Beacon Hill, whenever you took him into, say, a very nice Victorian house on Huron Ave in Cambridge, he was so out of place. He's a rough guy. As I said, he's a recovering alcoholic, a former NASCAR driver. The way I like to describe him is that he's blue-collar on his best days. That's the best he can ever hope to be. And that was not a comfortable fit for him, which was kind of interesting. And so in book 3, I moved him back out to Framingham, which is his natural milieu a little bit. But book 4, I thought, what is Conway's true comfort zone? Where does he really want to be? And the answer that kept coming back to me was these Blackstone Valley towns. As I say, I've said the names, and I'll say them again: Bellingham, Milford, Medford, Medway, that kind of thing. And that, again, is where we come up with Briar. I wanted this to feel like just the right fit for Conway. So in this book, though he technically still lives with a friend in Framingham, Conway spends a lot of time out in Briar. And I think some people have a feeling that that might become his natural home for future books in the series. I'm going to hold my next thought on Briar, because that leads me into a discussion of what I'm working on now. And let me segue just a little bit into the characters in my novels. I like writing blue-collar people. I'm a very fortunate man from a fortunate background, and I grew up in Hingham, which is a lovely town, and now I've lived a big chunk of my life in Southborough, another lovely town. But I like writing blue-collar people. I like writing people who work for a living and live paycheck to paycheck. I find that interesting. I find a natural affinity there. Now, I will say, Neil didn't mention this in his introduction, my day job is that I co-own a company that builds race cars down in Bellingham. And that's a pretty blue-collar activity, the racing itself, and also the type of folks that you meet when you're in that world. And I think that has something to do with how Briar came about, too. This is the natural people that I have a feel for and that Conway has a feel for. So let me read one thing from an interview I did with a guy recently around the release of this book, and then I'm going to read. Typically, I think it works out best when you don't do a lot of reading from your book at events like this one. It's hard to hold people's attention for a long time, so I promise you I am going to read 2 paragraphs. That's all I'm going to read. So, thinking about Briar, Blackstone Valley, blue-collar people, Framingham, this interviewer, who I was very simpatico with, this is a guy who really seems to get my work, asked me this question. I'll tell you his long question and then my answer. He said, Your writing brings Framingham to life and reveals a part of America often neglected by fiction. It's the type of place everyone knows but doesn't really think about or absorb. Your fiction stops and takes a look and says, there's some good stuff here, and some bad, too. It's a reflection of America and its troubles and anxieties. How did you decide what specific images or details you'd use to make everyday America, settings most folks might see as homogeneous, to make all this vital and fresh? And I loved that question because it sort of pushed a hot button for me. And so I said, one of the lamest and most enduring cliches of our time is that the suburbs are soulless bins of misery, as if anybody in, say, Cambridge or Brooklyn is automatically deeper and more complex than anybody in Westborough, Massachusetts, or Shaker Heights, Ohio. What a crock of crock. What a crock of crock, I said. I take great pleasure in pricking this balloon, which, I'm sad to say, flies high in publishing circles. That woman swinging her minivan into a strip mall Staples parking lot is no less precious, no less intelligent, no more or less fulfilled, no less worthy of study than her urban counterpart. I hope my characters and my settings reflect this. So with that in mind, I'll read my couple of paragraphs, and then I'll take some questions if anybody's got one. So here to sort of conclude that theme is a passage I wrote in Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage. And my editor, who is originally, she's a New Yorker now, but she is originally from Attleboro, she loved this paragraph because it spoke to her. And I think it amplifies this interview's selection that I just read to you. So Conway is with Harmon, who is this assistant acting chief of police of Briar, Massachusetts. And he's trying to loosen him up. And Harmon is a working, stiff, blue-collar guy like Conway. And so Conway gets him in his truck and takes him out for a drive to kind of get them both relaxed and hopefully get this, he's either a witness or a suspect, I won't say which, talking. And Conway says, Harmon told his story as I made a slow, clockwise loop, extending the drive to let him get the whole thing off his chest. Grafton, into Shrewsbury, into West Boylston and Boylston, running the southeastern side of the Wachusett Reservoir, driving the invisible part of the state, 20 minutes from Worcester and 70 from Boston, but mostly through pine forest and past ranch houses flying American flags, maybe with a trailered boat or a mid-sized RV in the front yard. The forest broken up by occasional strip mall zones with a Target, a Staples, a Panera Bread. Sound familiar? To out-of-staters, Massachusetts is Boston, Cape Cod, and the Berkshires, without much in between. You'd be surprised, though, how many people out my way visit Boston once a year, a family trip to a Red Sox game maybe, or dinner at a dress-up restaurant, and like it that way. This was my place. Cities don't suit me. So, that's all the reading I've got for you. I think that's about the right amount. So, questions. Questions not just about this book, not just about setting, but about anything. I know a lot of people are curious about the rise of self-publishing and that sort of thing. I'd love to talk about anything you'd like to talk about. Questions? Sir?
How did you develop the character of Conway? And what I'm thinking is, how much of you was built into him? I know there's a car connection there.
Yes.
How did the Conway character first evolve?
That's a great question. I'll repeat the question. How did I develop the character of Conway? How much of Conway is in me and vice versa? And I think, I bet many of you here have read many mystery series. And isn't that one of the fun questions that we all ask ourselves about our favorite series? You know, how much of Spencer is really Robert Parker and how much is made up? And it's tricky to say. There's certainly a lot. Conway certainly draws some of his notable character traits from me. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've been sober for a long time. And in fact, the entire idea for this series came from attending AA meetings here in Metro West. So I can tell you, so there's an obvious connection. And there's also the race car connection, which is very obvious. In addition to owning a company that builds race cars, I'm an amateur sports car racer myself. One of the things I like to say about Conway's character is this. I think there's a combination of self-examination, me taking a look at some of my own character traits and then pushing them into Conway, and wish fulfillment also when I write Conway. So here's the wish fulfillment side. Conway's big. He's tough. He's not scared of anything. You know, he goes charging into all these situations. Me, I'm a nice guy from the suburbs. I haven't had a fist fight since I was in 8th grade, and I lost it. So there's some of the obvious stuff where if you're going to write a hero, you want somebody pretty heroic and fearless and that sort of thing. On the other side of things, the stuff where you get to examine your character, that gets a little bit more complex because Conway's not me exactly, but it would be foolish for me to deny that some of his traits match my own, and that some of the relationships he has with his other characters, it would be foolish to deny that those relationships are not based on my own, because they just are. I mean, everything has to come from somewhere, and one of the sayings is write what you know. So there's certainly a lot of overlap and crossover there. But it would be a little bit simplistic to say, it's certainly, trust me, when I write about Conway chasing down some bad guys and ramming them in his car and getting out and fist fighting them, this is not autobiographical stuff. I'm just a nice guy in the suburbs. Hal, did you have a question?
I was going to ask, you started with Metro West. And
yeah.
You obviously know it very well. You can talk about Shrewsbury and all these other things. But this setting's Los Angeles. Did you have to go out there and familiarize yourself with that so you could?
A couple of people have asked me that question, which I'll repeat. I write fairly extensively in this book, especially in the early part, about greater Los Angeles. Did I go out there to do some research? Or what did I do? How did I figure out Los Angeles? And I did not go to Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, I was born in Los Angeles, but we moved away when I was 5 years old. So I don't know any more about greater LA than anybody else does. So it's just a matter of research. And the research, I mean, I have such respect for people who wrote novels before we had Google and Google Earth and Google Maps and Wikipedia, because one incredible resource I had when I was writing this long opening sequence that takes place in Van Nuys, California, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and it's in a real seedy area. I was just looking, I just had my one window in my laptop open to a very specific intersection, and I was looking at it on Google Earth, and I went, okay, here's this road, and it heads west, and here's the freeway back here, and if you take a left, you're coming out of here. And I don't know how they did that back. I'm lucky to be writing in this time. But that's not the only research I did. That kind of research is terrific. I also have what I call one-click Wikipedia research. I don't know a lot about firearms, so it's possible to learn a fair amount just by saying, Walther PPK, and you do a couple of clicks, and next thing you know, you can learn quite a bit about the gun of, a gun or anything else. But to really get more depth and to really write convincingly, you have to talk to people. And here's another, here the internet rides to the rescue again. I said on my Facebook page one day, hey, I'm writing such and such, can anybody tell me this, that, and this about greater Los Angeles, and some very specific questions. I had questions like, what would a title be for a woman in her late 20s who was moderately successful, who worked in television, but not as a star, somebody in the production arena. And sure enough, next thing I know, I've got 2 or 3 Facebook friends who are telling me this, that, the title would be associate producer, she would make about this much money. I said, where would she live? They said, oh, she might live in Tarzana. So I put her in Tarzana. And so you do that kind of research too. And I got to tell you, Hal, I have come to enjoy research. I used to talk about being a reluctant researcher, but I've really embraced it and come to appreciate the depth it gives the books. I don't know if you found this yourself, but a couple of people have told me they thought I must have gone to Los Angeles to write about it the way I wrote about it. And I considered that a great compliment because, again, I was 3,000 miles away. But again, talking about research, here are some of the things I thanked people for in my acknowledgments page here. Surfing lingo, demographics and geography in Southern California, surfing lingo. I had a firearms expert. I'm fortunate to have 2 friends who were longtime federal agents who can talk to me about, who filled me in on that sort of thing. And I had a coach teaching me everything I needed to know about conversational Brazilian Portuguese, which plays into this book in several scenes. So I really enjoy doing that research. I love it. And that is how you do that. Sandy.
It's kind of a 2-pronged question. Your process, do you hear the characters in your head telling you what to write, or do you outline the book ahead of time and kind of go page to page?
Great question. Do I hear the characters in my head? Do they sort of tell me what is happening, and do I let them direct things, or do I outline? And this is a classic process question. And it's very interesting for me because I have now changed my process completely. For a long time, including right up through this book, I was what's called a seat of the pants writer. I did not outline. Typically, I had an opening situation over here, and I always knew a closing line or a closing image or scene to wrap up the book. And my job was to write the 85,000 words to bring them together. And I just did that page by page, day by day, scene by scene. And sometimes you'll go down a blind alley. Sometimes you make a mistake and you have to throw out a fairly good chunk of what you've already written. But that worked for me. And it seems to me that that works for about half the writers I know. There's really sort of a 50-50 split between outliners and seat-of-the-pants writers. But the book I will tell you about in a moment, which I just finished writing and have just, I think Monday, sent to my agent, fingers crossed, I changed things up. And that was because you should never, as with anything else, you need to continue to grow and learn and improve as your career goes on. And a nagging voice in my head has always told me that outlining was a better way to do this. If not line by line, point by point outlines, I always had a feeling that my work would be better if I did more planning up front. So this last book, the book that I've just written, which I don't even know if it's going to sell, frankly, I did that. I found a software program, it's called Scribner. I don't know if any of you writers have heard of this. It essentially is a cork board for your computer. So you can sort of pin scenes to your computer, and they're very easy to move around. It's like having a cork board full of 3x5 cards, but it's super easy because it's all on your computer. And I used that to create an outline, to create a real plan. And I also read a couple of books on planning a novel, planning and outlining, that sort of structuring. And I'll be damned if it didn't work out very well for me. I felt that my scenes had more of a point to them because every day when I started writing, I knew not only what I had done yesterday, but I knew where I needed to go today, which may sound obvious, but when you're doing it by the seat of your pants, you know where you left off yesterday, but you don't really know where you're going today. And that's why you go down these blind alleys. So I am now an advocate of outlining or doing a fair amount of work up front, both for efficiency and because I think, for me, it has improved my writing.
So the second part of the question is, so you're writing, it's the same character in your novels, series. So when you're writing the book you did, Wolverine, were you already thinking about what you're going to do in the next book, the one you just sent out? So you kind of have a series in your head?
Yes. So the question is, just to repeat, since I'm writing a series, am I already thinking sometimes about books that come after this book? Is that a fair summation of the question? And here's the tricky answer. The book I just wrote is not in the series. I wrote a standalone, something completely different. But the answer to your question is yes. I do like to I think of it as salting my Conway Sachs books with little scenes, little settings, and especially characters who might come in handy somewhere down the road. And that has really paid off for me. I have put people in some of the early books not knowing exactly why, not having a lot of work for them to do in those books, but just because I wanted their name to be something that readers were familiar with, because they might play a large role in future books. And I'll give you the best example. I mentioned that the guy who gets kidnapped, I mentioned that Conway has a dear friend named Eudora Spoon in this novel. Well, Eudora, some of you might have read more than one of these books. Eudora has been in every one of my books, but she's always been a very minor character. I always described her as simply, she was elderly. She was in her 70s, then 80s, and she had she wore her hair in a white brush cut, and you knew that she was a member of Conway's AA group, but until this book, that was about all you knew about her. Well, I said, it's time for me to give Eudora a featured role in a book, because I loved her that much, and because my mom loved her a lot. My mom always wanted to know more about Eudora, so I said, Eudora's going to be big in Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage. And in fact, this entire book, the first line in this book was supposed to be, Eudora Spoon was old, and she was dying, but she wasn't dying the way old people die. That was supposed to be the first line in this book. Now, the line is still in the book. It opens up a chapter. It got pushed around a little bit. But this story was very much focused on Eudora right from the beginning. And Eudora was just a bit character in some of the earlier novels. So yes, I'm always doing that with characters. There is a state trooper named Venezia, a woman in this book. She is a state trooper. She plays a fairly minor role, but I put her in this book because I can see her playing a larger role in future books. So yes, that's how I do that. Now let me tell you a little bit about, I don't want to say much, but here's the thing. Wolverine Brothers Freight and Storage, the fourth Conway Sachs novel, is, I needed a break. Some of you know, some of you who have heard me speak before know that before I published Purgatory Chasm, I actually wrote 2 Conway Sachs novels that have never been published and that never will be published because they were me getting better at my craft. I've been writing Conway Sachs novels nonstop since 2007, and after Wolverine Brothers, Conway and I needed a little time apart. We needed a little space, and so I have spent the year, actually only 6 months. I wrote this book very quickly. I spent 6 months writing something completely different, actually for a different market. I don't want to say much about it because you may never hear about it again, but it's different. And that is the book that I just sent to my literary agent, who's fantastic. And so now I sit here like this saying, what is she going to say to me? Is she going to say, yes, we will try selling this book? Or is she going to say, back to the drawing board? I hope that she will. I think she'll like it. And I think, I think that book probably has a future. But I want to play my cards close to the chest, so I won't say too much about it. Although I will say it involves race cars and greyhounds. The other great passion of my life is rescue greyhounds. So yes. Any other questions? Yes, Karen.
I loved the relationship between Conway and Sophie. That was a very small part.
Thank you. The question is about the relationship between Conway and Sophie. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Sophie. Sophie is the daughter of Conway's girlfriend. Conway has a complicated relationship with a very strong woman named Charlene Bollinger. She also is a recovering addict. They met in AA, and they have a stormy relationship. I mean, it's got to be stormy in books, right? It's always stormy. Can't have a simple relationship. Charlene has a daughter, Sophie, who is 12, 13 years old, and she loves Conway so much, and he loves her too. And I have to say, I'm a little nervous about saying this on television, but of all my characters, Sophie is the one that I love most. She is beloved by many readers, and she, much more than anybody else in my books, is based on a specific person, which is my daughter Lucy. Lucy's no longer 12 or 13 years old because people age differently in real life and books. But Sophie is the apple of Conway's eye, just as my daughter is the apple of my eye. So thank you for liking that relationship. I like that relationship too. And it was a struggle in this book to keep that relationship going. You know, I sort of had to make an excuse to get Sophie into this book, but I always want Sophie in my Conway stories.
That's good.
Yes, another question.
Are any of your books available as e-books, or are they all hardcover?
My books, yes, they are all available. Are my books available as e-books? Yes, they're all available as e-books. They're available on Kindle and what's the Barnes & Noble one? Nook. And some of the other very minor platforms, Kobo and things like that, Apple iBooks. They're available as pretty much everything. My publisher is Minotaur, a wonderful publisher that is an imprint, they call it, basically a branch of St. Martin's Press, one of the real big publishers. So I'm very fortunate to have them behind me. So the books are available in hardcover. The first book, Purgatory Chasm, is available in softcover as well. I wish the other books were. That's up to the publisher, and I don't know when that will happen. And they're also available as audiobooks from audible.com. So,
Do you notice any difference in the demographics, who's buying them? Do you have any information on that? Or, I mean, people like me like a book. You know,
oh, yes. Do I notice anything about the demographics of who buys what kind of book? I don't know. I suppose if I pushed, I could get more information on that sort of thing. But I don't push for that sort of information. I do know that my books, as books in general, are selling more and more electronically and less in hard copy. That's just the trend in the industry. And I completely agree with you. I like nothing better than just holding my book in my hands. But the way of the world seems to be going more and more digital. And especially when you look at the price differential, you know, when you're asking people to make a pretty big commitment to buy a hardcover book these days. And they're taking a much smaller risk when they buy, you know, a $7 or $8 or $10 ebook. Yes, sir.
How many people are you involved with? Maybe team isn't the right term, but could you mention your editor and your agent?
Mm-hmm.
Not being a writer myself, how many people do you work with in the course of publishing?
That's a great question. How many people do I work with in the course of publishing a book? And I'll use this as a little springboard to talk about the difference between publishing with what's called a traditional publisher, which is what I do, and self-publishing, which is very popular these days and is growing. I have a literary agent. Almost all novels these days are sold through literary agents. The publishers just won't look at a novel if it comes over the transom the way they used to. So I do have a literary agent, and she's my representative. She's on my team. She's advocating for me. Then at my publisher, I work with primarily one editor, and she is in charge of doing the heavy lifting of taking the manuscript that I send her and really doing what's called a developmental edit. That is, not simply finding little mistakes and correcting small stuff, but she is in charge of helping me improve the manuscript any way we can by fixing big stuff, including real structural things. I had one book where a murder that took place on page 110 or something, my editor strongly felt this has to happen much earlier in the story. You need this to happen on page, say, 40. And wow, you can imagine how much work was involved in taking something that far back in the book and moving it up. But that's the kind of work that a good editor does, and I have a great one. So she does that first structural pass at editing, and we talk over the phone and compromise on, figure out exactly what we're going to do. Then I send it back to her, and typically she has another much smaller round of edits. I do that, and then it goes on to a copy editor. And good copy editors are worth their weight in gold. They're the ones who, again, yes, they find all the typos and the little mistakes and the thises and that's, but they also find all the timeline issues. A novel is a big, complicated thing, and you can imagine how many little issues could slip through about, here it's the second week of February, and now it's 5 pages later, but you're saying it's early February, and, then 10 pages later you say the temperature is 65 degrees out. You can imagine how many timeline type issues there are in a book before it gets corrected. So anyway, structural edit, good copy edit, which is a lot of work for a copy editor. And then there's proofreading after that, which is typically done by a different person. And there's also production editing, the people who make sure everything looks right on the pages. And there are the cover design people, and there are publicity and marketing people. It's quite a team that puts a novel together when you work with a wonderful publisher the way I do. Now, when you self-publish, guess who's in charge of doing every one of those tasks? You are. It's a lot of work. It's hard to be very good at all of those tasks. And I think that's why I think self-publishing is very exciting. I think it's great that more and more people have different paths to choose to get their books out to people. But to me, I very seldom see self-published books that really look as professional as mine do, for example, because there's just so much involved. So, big team. And if there are no further questions, if there are, fire away. If there are not, I want to thank you again for coming out on this night. And I have books for sale that I'd love to autograph for you. Now, the new book is $20, but I also have a couple of the earlier books, hardcover, for $10, because I got them cheap, and I'd love to pass that along. We pass the savings along to you. So is there anything else? Well, thank you, folks. I appreciate your time.